vacation if you had one. But even if you haven't had one, you are about to have an adventure, because you are about to take a trip in time, a trip in space, and a trip in various levels of consciousness and diverse ideas and practices in a distant realm known in Hebrew as Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. For some of you, either because of your prior studies or because of your mindset, this will either be a somewhat familiar territory or a somewhat distant and exotic realm. However, I hope for each of you it proves to be both an interesting realm and a stimulating realm. We will be taking various aerial excursions, surveying broad typographies of various ages and ideas, and we will occasionally land in order to view the typology by digging into the soil of specific texts, specific movements, times, places, and individual thinkers. And as you will hopefully see, and as I will try to delineate, the approach I want to use in studying Jewish mysticism is somewhat unusual, particularly within an academic setting. For most of the 26 years that I've taught Jewish mysticism, I've done it in the typical academic way, which is to do it historically. To begin at the beginning, after a lengthy discussion of when is the beginning, and then to track it through the centuries. I'm not doing it that way. Other scholars like to focus on a single movement or a single text. In the Jewish mystical literature, I'm not doing it that way. The way I want to approach it is to look at Jewish mysticism as a spiritual journey within Jewish experience, and therefore to focus on four things. First, what is the nature of that journey? In other words, what is the nature? What are the characteristics of the realm that we know as Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah? The second area I want to focus on is the language of the mystics. Learning an area or studying an area like Jewish mysticism is like learning a new language. Not simply because the major texts of Jewish mysticism are written in foreign languages like Hebrew and Aramaic. We're not going to study Hebrew or Aramaic. But because an area like Jewish mysticism, like a foreign language, comes out of a foreign or different mindset. It offers us a different way of looking at the world, at the self, and at sacred texts. So studying Jewish mysticism is like learning a new language, sometimes difficult and frustrating at first, but hopefully eventually you get it. But in order to get it, you have to understand that it is a different mindset than many of us are used to, and a different way of expressing things than most of us are used to. The third thing we have to look at is the goals and the destinations of various Jewish mystics on that journey known as Jewish mysticism. Where did they want to end up? What did they want to discover? Where did they want to be? And then fourthly and finally, we have to look at the techniques that Jewish mystics employed in their attempt to reach those destinations and those goals. And I'll have more to say on all of those later. And you see the reading list that you got, the curriculum that you got, reflects those four ideas. So in the next 10 weeks, this is what we will be discussing. And you notice that we will meet consecutively for 10 weeks with only one break, and that will be on President's Day. The break isn't because it's President's Day. The break will be because, as it happens, on that day, February 18th, or the next day, February 18th, from our scheduled class, I will be giving a lecture in the Israeli Embassy in Washington, and so I'll be out of town on that day. Now, I'd like to discuss how Jewish mysticism has been viewed in modern times in order to give us a backdrop, in order to see how Jewish mysticism has been viewed in recent centuries, so we can see how different approaches to Jewish mysticism look at it in different ways, and how the approach I'm taking here differs from those other approaches. Let me begin this exercise with 3 stories. Some of you may have heard one or all of these stories before, but it doesn't hurt to hear them again. The first story is a story, as far as I know it's a true story, about the late Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir. The story is told that Golda Meir very desperately wanted Charles de Gaulle to visit Israel. A lot of the heads of many countries had visited Israel, but for some reason Charles de Gaulle from France had not visited Israel. So finally Charles de Gaulle agreed to come to Israel. And he came to Israel. He was given a tour of Israel. He was very impressed with what he saw. And as he was about to leave Israel, Golda Meir said to him, "Well, Mr. de Gaulle, is there anything you'd like to see that you haven't seen before you leave our country?" And de Gaulle said, "Well, you know, Madam Prime Minister, when a dignitary comes to France, one of the things they always do when they're in France is to visit the tomb of the unknown soldier. So before I leave Israel, I would like to visit the tomb of Israel's unknown soldier." Now, as it happened at that time, there was no tomb of Israel's unknown soldier. Now, there is such a thing, but then there wasn't. But Golda Meir did not want to disappoint de Gaulle, so she said to him, "Fine, on the way to the airport, when you'll go back to Paris, on the way to the airport to the plane back to Paris, we'll stop at the tomb of the unknown soldier." So de Gaulle leaves very happy, and Golda Meir's adjutant says to her, "Madam Prime Minister, you crazy? We don't have a tomb of the unknown soldier." So she said in her typical way, "Don't worry. On the way to the airport is a cemetery. Go to the cemetery, find a nice grave, well kept. And in front of the grave, in front of the tombstone, get some big wreaths. Get some big wreaths and block out the name on the tombstone, and put up a sign, 'This is the grave of Israel's unknown soldier.'" So the adjutant took a shortcut, went to the cemetery, did what she said, and then a few minutes later the motorcade comes, de Gaulle gets out of the limousine, Golda Meir gets out, all the dignitaries get out, they go to the grave, there's the sign, Tomb of Israel's unknown soldier, de Gaulle salutes, they sing the Israeli national anthem, the French national anthem, they fire a few guns, and everybody is happy, and de Gaulle is turning to walk back to his limousine when all of a sudden a big wind comes. And the big wind blows the wreaths away from the tombstone, revealing what's written on the tombstone. And what's written on the tombstone is something like this: "Here lies Hyman Shapiro of Cincinnati, Ohio, a great industrialist, loving father, devoted husband, and great friend of Israel." So de Gaulle turns to Golda Meir and he says, "Madam Prime Minister, you told me that this was the tomb of Israel's unknown soldier. How do you account for the fact that this is the tomb of some guy from Cincinnati?" And Golda Meir, never lost for words, says, "Well, you see, Mr. de Gaulle, as a devoted husband, Mr. Shapiro was very well known. As a great friend of Israel, he was very well known. As a great industrialist, he was very well known. But as a soldier, he was unknown. So that's story number one. Now, what does this have to do with Jewish mysticism? I would suggest that despite the fact that if you go to a bookstore today, you find many books about Jewish mysticism. There are many classes given in Jewish mysticism. On television, you see things on Jewish mysticism. A lot of people talk about Jewish mysticism. I would suggest that even despite all of this, Jewish mysticism is really unknown. And that most of the books that you see in the bookstore and the people talking about it don't know very much about it. Roseanne now is talking about it. Deepak Chopra is talking about it. But I would suggest they don't know very much about it. Strangely, this is not a new situation. In the 16th century, in Poland, and 16th century of Poland was a great, probably one of the greatest centers of Jewish scholarship ever. One of the greatest of the scholars of 16th century Jewish Poland was a man who was chief rabbi of Krakow named Moses Isserles. Rabbi Moses Isserles. In Hebrew, he is known by his acronym Ramah, Rabbi Moses Isserles. And he wrote a book on Jewish thought called in Hebrew Torah Ta'olah. And in this book, he says as follows. He says, people come to me all the time wanting to study Jewish mysticism when they can't tell the difference between one verse in the Bible and another. So you see, things haven't changed. Second story. Once there was a young lady, and this young lady had a question that was bothering her. A rather simple question, not a very simple answer. The question was, what is truth? What is truth? So she made a fatal mistake in trying to find the answer to this question. The fatal mistake was she enrolled in a course in philosophy. Soon she had more questions than an answer. She became very depressed until she met a friend of hers. And her friend told her that in a distant land there is a sacred mountain. And on top of the sacred mountain is a holy cave. And in this holy cave lives the high priestess of the cult of truth. And if she would travel there and ask her question, she would undoubtedly have an answer. So the young lady sold everything she had, traveled to the distant land with great difficulties, found the mountain with great difficulties, climbed it with great difficulties, and when she entered the cave, she found a very elderly, very elegant woman with beautiful emerald eyes, meditating by staring at the light at the end of a candle. She waited an hour for her to finish meditating, 2 hours, 3 hours. Finally, she finished meditating. And the young woman approached the older woman and she said to her, I have traveled very far, and I have sacrificed very much, and I have studied very hard, and my question has still not been answered. Maybe you can answer it. Are you the high priestess of the cult of truth? And the older woman said yes. She said, then my question is, tell me please, what is truth? And the older woman looked at her deeply with her bright emerald eyes, and she said to her, truth is like a pool of water. And the young woman said, come again? She said, truth is like a pool of water. And the younger woman said, you mean that's it? This is what I searched for? This is what I sacrificed for? This is what I studied to find? Truth is like a pool of water? That's it? And the older woman very serenely and calmly looked at her and said, you mean it's not a pool of water? This second story indicates, in my view, a basic characteristic of the mystic that has been very misunderstood. And that is that the mystic is not necessarily the one who believes that he or she has found truth, that he or she knows the truth, but rather the mystic is one who assumes they haven't found the truth. That the mystic is the ultimate skeptic. That the mystic, therefore, is one always open to new possibilities. Because the mystic, and certainly the Jewish mystic, begins with the premise that truth is elusive, that truth dwells behind a whirl of veils. In the Aramaic of the Zohar, the major work of the medieval Jewish mystics, our world is called Alma de Shikra, the world of falsehood. The idea is that in our world, in our dimension, in our perception, in the realm of our possibility here, in this world, absolute truth is unknowable, unattainable, unavailable. And what the mystic tries to do is to begin with the assumption that what we see is not necessarily the real, that what we see may be an illusion, that what we see may be, I'm using see in the more generic sense of experience and perceive, that what we perceive may be false. And because of that, to try to pierce through all that, pierce through the veils of illusion to the light, to the truth, to the reality that dwells beyond it. I was once at a dinner with the late Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in '78, and someone at the dinner said to Mr. Singer, be a realist. And Singer said, I'd be very happy to be a realist if I knew what reality was. So for the mystic, we don't precisely know. Let me give you two examples. One example is that because, in their view, this world is bound to materiality, it therefore is a world in which the realm of total spirituality and truth is obviously something else beyond us. And for that reason, in this world, we can never know absolute truth. Even a Jewish philosopher like Franz Rosenzweig, who was not a Jewish mystic, once said, truth is a noun only for God. For human beings, it's an adjective. In other words, we cannot know in this world the truth. All we can know are reflections of the truth, shades of the truth, but not the absolute truth. For Judaism, the highest we get in this world, as opposed to the next world, the totally spiritual world, the highest we get in this world is the Messianic era. That's the time of the realization, the fulfillment of this world. So let me give two examples of perception of truth in the Messianic era as opposed to the historical era, which is our era now. One Hasidic master who lived in 19th century Ukraine, Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, said, in the Messianic era, we will understand not only the letters of the Torah, but we will also understand the white spaces between the letters of the Torah. In other words, no matter how great a scholar one is in this historical period, no matter if they're the greatest scholar who ever lived, they still will not understand the real meaning of the Torah. Only in the Messianic era they will understand the two components, the text and the white spaces. If you've seen a Torah scroll, you know the letters have little embellishments on them. Something like that, little crowns. And one tradition is that in the historical period, at best, we understand the letters, but in the Messianic era, we will also understand the crowns. A second example is that there is a tradition, as many of you know, we have 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There is a tradition that in the Messianic era, a 23rd letter will be revealed. And where it goes in each word in the Torah will also be revealed. So if you have a new letter, you're going to have new words. If you have new words, you're going to have new meanings. And if you have new meanings, which happen to be the right meanings, which are eclipsed from us now, it means that no matter how much we know of the Torah now, will be nothing compared to what we'll know in the Messianic era when the 23rd letter is revealed. So here you have some examples of the view that the mystic begins with skepticism. Begins with the assumption that the apparent is not necessarily the real. Begins with the assumption that truth is veiled, and that at best we can open the crack of the door somewhat. Now let me give you the third story, which expresses this view even more strongly than the second. Same view. The very powerful story. Story is this. A young man was searching for truth. And he finally, after searching for a long time in many places, met an old man. And the old man said to him, the old man was very wise, and said to him, I have found it. When I was a young man, I found truth. And the young man said, well, where do I go to find it? What is it? And the older man said, truth is the most beautiful woman in the world, and she lives in a distant land in an enchanted forest. And here is a map. And on the map is an X, and at that X, that's where you'll find truth. So the young man looked at the map and he realized the X was very far away. He traveled for a very long time. And finally, he looked at the map and realized he was approaching the X. And as he was approaching, he looked around and he was in a totally desolate, arid desert. And he remembered what the wise man had told him, that truth dwells in an enchanted forest. So he thought maybe he was wrong. Until as he approached the X, he saw in the distance a figure of a woman in the sand. He ran toward the figure. And as he approached, he saw it was the figure of a woman wrapped in robes. And as he came close, she revealed her face to him, and he saw a very ugly, dried up, stringy hair, toothless, deformed, old woman. And he said to her, who are you? And she said, it's just as the old wise man told you who was here so many years ago. I am truth. And he said, but the old man told me the truth was the most beautiful woman in the world. And you certainly, with all due respect, are not. And the old woman said, but I am. I am truth. And he said, so why did the old wise man tell me that you were the most beautiful woman in the world and you lived in an enchanted forest? And she said, if he told you the truth, would you have come? And the young man said, so what do I do now? I go back to civilization? What should I, when I'm an old man, what should I tell a young man looking for truth? And she said, do what was done to you. Lie. So here you have the idea that what we think is the truth may be the opposite. That things appear as one thing and may be really the other thing. And a message that you find in most mystical systems, and that is that the quest, if you reach the goal, can be dangerous. What you are looking for is the light, to be enlightened. But light is also a fire that can burn you. So this is why in most mystical traditions you have a kind of caveat emptor, a kind of buyer beware, that there is a danger involved in the quest. And part of the danger may be when you reach the goal. Oscar Wilde once said, the worst curse that a person who prays for things can have is that the prayers can be answered. Now we will see a little later some other characteristics of Jewish mysticism. But now I want to move to how Jewish mysticism has been viewed, particularly within Jewish tradition in the West, namely in Europe, Western Europe and America, in the last few hundred years, in order to set a backdrop to how we can view it today. Let me begin this part of the discussion by telling you a little story which actually happened to me when I joined the faculty here many years ago. I went to the first faculty meeting. Senior member of the faculty introduced himself, and he said, what are you teaching this semester? And I said, Jewish mysticism. And he said, well, how can you teach a subject that doesn't exist? This was a very popular view until very recently. Namely, the idea that Jewish mysticism, even if it does exist, should be excommunicated from Judaism. That it's not really part of Judaism. This idea, this approach, I would say, really began in modern times in the 17th century with Spinoza. Spinoza, who lived in 17th century Amsterdam, just let me read to you one sentence from his great book, the Theological Political Treatise. He said, I have read and I have known certain Kabbalistic triflers whose insanity provokes my unceasing astonishment. Can't say it any more directly than this. Now, when we come to the 18th century, you have in Western Europe what came to be called the Jewish Enlightenment. The Jewish Enlightenment, the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, was a great Jewish philosopher who lived in Germany by the name of Moses Mendelssohn. Some of you may be more aware of his grandson, the composer Felix Mendelssohn. And it's in a way kind of ironic, to give it a kind of local Chicago twist, that when the Second World War began, the Consul General of Germany, which was already then a Nazi government, Consul General of Germany in Chicago was a Mendelssohn, was a descendant of Moses Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn began with the view, which was very popular in the 18th century, that that which is rational is that which is true. And therefore, if something is not rational, consequently, it can't be true. And since for him, Judaism is true, it therefore had to be rational. So Mendelssohn's view of Judaism, coming out of the ideas of the 18th century French Enlightenment and into the Jewish Enlightenment, was that truth and rationality are equal, are the same. That in order for something to be true, it had to be rational. And since he wanted to show the non-Jewish world that Judaism was true, or at least as true as any other religion, particularly as true as Christianity, he argued that Judaism is a rational religion. Now, rational meant two things, not only what it was, but what it's not. Rational meant not emotional, not sentimental, and also meant not mystical. So Mendelssohn sort of began a trend in the 18th century to present Judaism, to define Judaism, to understand Judaism as a rational system of thought devoid of emotion and devoid of mysticism. As it happened, this tactic backfired, because in the 19th century, when Romanticism was in and rationalism was out, his own grandchildren said, well, if Grandpa was right, that Judaism is rational, and now rationality is out, then we're going to leave Judaism. And within 100 years of Mendelssohn's death, in 1786, all of his direct descendants had converted out of Judaism by then. But Mendelssohn set a tone for equating Judaism with rationalism, and for making anything mystical considered either some kind of lunatic fringe within Judaism, or something inimical to Judaism, or something that used to be there, or is there, but should not be there. In other words, the beginning of an attempt, of a design, to strain out of Judaism all mysticism. The place where they began to do this was in the liturgy, namely in the prayer books. And you see this already in the people who were influenced by Mendelssohn. Let me first read you two sentences from a letter that Mendelssohn wrote to one of his leading disciples, Elkin Hertz, in 1771, which expressed this view of Judaism as a religion totally of reason. He said, "We have no principles which are contrary to or beyond reason. The principles and fundamentals of our religion are based upon pillars of reason and agree in every respect with true analysis and speculation without any contradiction or controversy whatsoever." On the basis of this view, that Judaism is a totally rational religion, the attempt began, soon after Mendelssohn, to reform it along rationalist lines. And the place this reform began was in the liturgy, in the prayer book. So, for example, already, during his own lifetime, Mendelssohn's own lifetime in 1779, his disciple David Friedlander, who is one of the European ancestors of what is now known as Reform Judaism, insisted that the Jewish liturgy, the Jewish prayer book, be amended, be edited, be reformed in order to express this idea of Judaism as a rational religion. And here's what Friedlander wrote. He said, "From century to century, these prayers became more and more numerous and worse, because their conceptions became more mystical, muddied with the principles of Kabbalah, which were in direct contradiction to to the genuine spirit of Judaism. So here you had the view beginning to build up and escalate that mysticism was not part of Judaism. Mysticism was not simply a lunatic fringe within Judaism, but rather mysticism was inimical to Judaism, contradictory of Judaism, the opposite of Judaism, the counterpoint of Judaism, and had really nothing to do with Judaism. And this idea that Judaism is a totally rational religion, devoid of mysticism and in opposition to mysticism, became in the 19th century, both in Europe and later in America, one of the key underpinnings of the ideology of the movement now known as Reform Judaism. In writing after writing of the leaders of Reform Judaism in America, you find, and in Europe, you find this idea. Give you one or two examples. Isaac Mayer Wise, one of the great figures in American Reform Judaism, said, "Divine revelation is the twin sister of reason." But the major statement of importance historically was the 1886 document of the Reform movement in America called the Pittsburgh Platform. And in the sixth plank of this platform, summarizing the ideology of Reform Judaism, the Reform rabbis of America said as follows. They said, "We recognize in Judaism a progressive religion." What does progressive religion mean? They define it now. A progressive religion ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. So in other words, reason became the determining factor of what Judaism was, still on this 18th century assumption that that which is rational is that which is true. Now this opposition to Jewish mysticism, this attempt to neutralize the influence of Jewish mysticism in Judaism, this attempt to excommunicate, if you will, mysticism from Judaism, then became incorporated in the 19th century in the works of the great Jewish scholars of that period, in the works of the first generations of what was called in Germany the scientific study of Judaism, the Wissenschaft des Judentums. And the greatest of all of the Jewish historians of that century, and according to some, the greatest of all Jewish historians who ever lived, namely Heinrich Gretz, who wrote a work in 9 volumes, The History of the Jews, Geschichte der Juden, 6 volumes in English, translation condensed. If you read this 9-volume work of Gretz, what it really reads as is a kind of good guy, bad guy novel, where the good guys are the rationalist philosophers and the bad guys are the mystics. Gretz had 2 agendas running here. One agenda was to show that Judaism is a rational religion, and therefore true. And secondly, he had a socio-political agenda running. The socio-political agenda was to show Western governments, like the German government, Austrian government, French government, and so forth, that Jews were as enlightened as non-Jews, and that Jews from the West, namely Western Europe, had really nothing to do with those East European Jews. That we shouldn't allow us to get confused with them, because we can understand why you don't want to give them equal rights, but we're enlightened, so you should give us equal rights. By them, of course, he meant the Jews in Poland, Russia, and so forth. What is in a way ironic is that Gretz lived in Breslau, which then was in Germany, but which now is in Poland, is Wrocław. Now, let me give you some examples from Gretz's history of how he states this, so you don't think I'm making any of this up. Writing about the development of Jewish mysticism in 13th century Spain, from which the Zohar, the major work of the Jewish mystics, came, Gretz wrote as follows. The Kabbalists of the 13th century in Spain obscured the mental light with which the men of the intellect, from Sadya to Maimonides, had illumined Judaism, and the mystics substituted for refined belief fantastic and even blasphemous chimeras. The intellectual degradation of the Jews in the following centuries is, to a large extent, their work. They, meaning the Kabbalists, led astray both their own times and posterity through designed or unintentional imposition, and the injuries which they inflicted on Judaism are felt even at the present day. Clear? Another quote. He's talking here about the Zohar, the most central work of the Jewish mystical tradition. He says, I'm not going to read the whole thing. He says, occasionally it gives a faint suggestion of an idea, but in a trice it evaporates into feverish fantasies or dissolves into childish silliness. Now, speaking of the last great movement of Jewish mysticism, which was still very vibrant in his own day, and which was developed in Eastern Europe, namely Hasidism, Gretz has the following to say. Describing Hasidism, he writes, "There is a new sect, a daughter of darkness, born in gloom, which even today proceeds stealthily on its mysterious way. This is plunging Jewry into a state of primitive barbarism." That's his view of Hasidism, the last great movement of Jewish mysticism. So here you have the view, developed by the rationalist Jewish philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, Spinoza, Mendelssohn, down, so forth, coming into Reform Judaism, coming into the great histories of the Jews being written, and then percolating down through the rabbis and the scholars to the people. And the people, therefore, coming up with the conclusion, both Jews and Christians, that either Judaism has no mystical tradition, if it does, it's a lunatic fringe, if it does, it should be thrown out of Judaism, excommunicated from Judaism, and that mysticism is something inimical to Judaism, has really very little to do with it, if anything. So I would suggest to you that until very recently, and very recently I'm talking the last 15, 20 years, which in the history of a religion like Judaism is a twinkle of an eye. In the last until the last 15 or 20 years, for the 150 or more years before that, in Western Europe and in the United States, the dominant view in the Jewish community, and as a result of the work of these individuals I quoted and others, the dominant view in much of the non-Jewish community was, and in some quarters still is, that there is no such thing as Jewish mysticism. Like my senior colleague that I quoted to said, how can you study something that doesn't exist? And if there is such a thing as Jewish mysticism, the dominant view was Gretz's view. This was something inimical to Judaism, something inside but subversive of Judaism, something that damaged Judaism, and something that really was never a part of it and should never have become a part of it and should be thrown out as soon as possible before it becomes dangerous. Now, even though this was a dominant view until very recently ago, nonetheless, toward the beginning of the century, a number of scholars, Jewish scholars, began to reevaluate this view of Mendelssohn and the view of Gretz and the view of Hertz and the view of others about the place of mysticism in Judaism. And I would say, in my view, the first prominent Jewish scholar that tried to convince people that mysticism was an essential part of Judaism, was the person who was generally considered the father of conservative Judaism in America, and that is Solomon Schechter. You know, there is a chain of Jewish day schools named after Schechter, the Solomon Schechter Day Schools. And when I mentioned Schechter once in a lecture on Jewish mysticism in the synagogue in the northern suburbs here, somebody raised their hand and said, "Oh, I thought that Solomon Schechter was the name of a guy who gave some money to, build these schools." They didn't realize that he was father of conservative Judaism. Anyway, Solomon Schechter, who died in 1915, had already begun writing around the turn of the century about the importance, centrality, and nature of the Jewish mystical tradition and of East European Jewry in a very positive light. But it wasn't until later that one scholar, in effect single-handedly, established the respectability of the field of Jewish mysticism by, in effect, establishing the field of Jewish mysticism. And this was the late Professor Gershom Scholem of the Hebrew University. Scholem was a German Jew who, when in his 20s, decided to become a Zionist. Now, I don't know if you really can conceive of what it meant for, say, German Jewish parents, bourgeoisie parents in 1920s in Germany to have a son who is a Zionist. It's like having, a son today who would say a Hare Krishna or something like this. And Scholem left the family and began studying Jewish mysticism, eventually went to what was then Palestine, and joined the faculty of a new university in the 20s called the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he, in effect, really established the field of Jewish mysticism. And he did this by doing, I would say, three major things. The first thing he did was to establish that the field of Jewish mysticism is a viable academic area within Jewish studies. No one had ever considered it that way before. Now, it's a true story. Scholem's book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, which is now a classic, been reprinted many times, was based on a series of lectures he gave in New York in 1938 at the Jewish Institute of Religion. And when he came to give those lectures, he was introduced by a very great scholar, happened to have been one of my teachers, the late Professor Saul Lieberman, one of the greatest Talmudists of this century. And he introduced Scholem in the following way. He said, mysticism, Kabbalah, he used the Yiddish word, is a mishigas. It's a neurosis. But the study of a mishigas is scholarship. In other words, Scholem, you're wasting your time, but what you're doing is still scholarship. So even Lieberman, who was against Kabbalah, recognized that Scholem, even already then in the 30s, had established the study of Jewish mysticism as a respectable academic field within Jewish studies. The second thing that Scholem did, which no one had really done before, is to offer a basic bibliography of the field of Jewish mysticism in its entirety. In other words, to present what are the works that constitute the important works of the literature of Jewish mysticism, and what are they, and what are they all about? This is the second thing that Scholem did. And the third thing I think that Scholem did was to prove, with tremendous erudition and historical research and knowledge, that Jewish mysticism is a vital part of Judaism and not, as Gretz tried to suggest, and other historians, a lunatic fringe. But Scholem's method and approach, at least in my view, had a number of problems connected to it, even despite its great achievements. First of all, Scholem focused on Kabbalah as primarily an intellectual exercise, as a kind of history of ideas, and therefore neglected the experiential side of Kabbalah. And so, until very recently, in scholarship on Jewish mysticism, the whole area of the experience of the mystic has been neglected in favor of what Scholem emphasized, which was the intellectual apparatus of the mystic, the ideas of the mystic. And as you'll see, the approach that I want to take here is to try to link these two aspects together. In other words, to link the experience of the mystic with the ideational substructure which interplays with that experience, to show how certain ideas of the mystics influence their experiences, what kind of experiences they have, they would not have without these intellectual constructs, but then to show how the experiences themselves change the intellectual constructs. Secondly, Scholem, in my view, imposed categories of understanding on Jewish mysticism rather than focusing on the question that I want to focus our attention on here, which is, how did the Jewish mystics understand Jewish mysticism? I'm not interested in imposing our contemporary or ideological categories on the Jewish mystics. I'm more interested in what did the Jewish mystics understand as was happening to them. What are the categories in which they thought about what they were involved in, rather than what are the categories that we use to understand what they were involved in. And in terms of Scholem's reading of Jewish mysticism, I would give you some examples of what I consider to be ideological constructs that he imposed on Jewish mysticism. One, very simply, is his Zionist ideological construct. Essentially, he was interested in those aspects of Jewish mysticism as they relate to the land of Israel. So he tells you a lot about, for example, the development of Jewish mysticism in Safed, in Tzfat, in Israel in the 16th century. He wrote in Hebrew a tremendous 2-volume work. In English it's 1,000 pages on the very famous false Jewish Messiah Shabtai Tzvi, because for Scholem, Shabtai Tzvi was the father of Zionism. Not Herzl, but Shabtai Tzvi. I just saved you reading 1,200 pages, but you can read it. You should read it. It's a great book, and you should also read it because it'll never be made into a movie. Scholem's second ideological construct was that he was, I would say, not simply a non-halachic Jew, but almost an anti-halachic Jew. He was against or cast off Jewish religious observances. And he constantly wanted to show that the Kabbalistic tradition was a Gnostic tradition that was antinomian, that was against Jewish law. And I think in this he was wrong, and tried to impose his categories on the Jewish mystics. The third ideological position I want to mention, I can mention a lot of them, but I'll only mention one more, is the fact that Scholem was a German Jew, who had certain definite prejudices against East European Jews. And this is very clear in the way he tells the story of Jewish mysticism. Because he de-emphasizes the developments of Jewish mysticism in Central and Eastern Europe from, say, the 16th century onward. To give you one simple example, as I mentioned to you, he wrote this tremendous work on Shabtai Tzvi. But one of the greatest Jewish mystics, who you'll hear a lot from me about, was the 16th century Jewish mystic who lived in Central and Eastern Europe, probably the greatest of all the Ashkenazic Jewish thinkers of that period, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague, known in Hebrew as the Maharal of Prague. I wrote a book on him, some of you know. In Scholem's major trends in Jewish mysticism, he gives him, I would say, 3/4 of a page. And this past summer, I was visiting at Hebrew University campus in Jerusalem, and there they have Scholem's private library. And so I went with some friends of mine who teach there to see Scholem's private library. And it's an extraordinary library, maybe 30,000 books. And so I decided I would see if Scholem had any of the writings of Judah Loew, the Maharal of Prague. He had every 30,000 books, every possible thing you can imagine, but he didn't have one book by the Maharal of Prague. So I would say that Scholem imposed this anti-East European prejudice on his understanding of Jewish mysticism, and therefore neglected, in my view, the great importance of the last great movement in Jewish mysticism, which I will be referring to a great deal here, namely Hasidism. Because in my view, what Hasidism really represents, though in popular literature it has been very misrepresented, especially by Martin Buber and others, is that Hasidism is really the culmination, the summation of everything that went before it in the Jewish mystical tradition. In other words, in Hasidism, if you know where to look, you can find the earlier ideas all culminating and interweaving together. And if you look in various Hasidic texts, you can see echoes of earlier texts. But if you want to see Jewish mysticism coming to its fullness and culmination, you look in Hasidism, which, compared to other movements in Jewish mysticism, Scholem grossly neglected. Now Scholem, for whatever reasons, also wanted to show that Jewish mysticism began rather late in Jewish history. He wanted to show that Jewish mysticism developed as a reaction, that various movements, or as he called them, major trends in Jewish mysticism, developed as reactions to various crises in Jewish history. And this I find problematic for two reasons, and these two reasons are important for the way I want here to approach Jewish mysticism. First of all, if you have an ideology, which in my view unfortunately is a very prevalent ideology in the Jewish community today, which is the crisis ideology. Everything is a crisis, right? You go from crisis to crisis. Now, if you go from crisis to crisis, and everything that occurs in Jewish history is a reaction to that crisis, then it is impossible to have any continuity of the tradition. Crisis mentality is the opposite of an ideology of continuity. Because to have continuity, you need an on-flowing tradition. And what I would suggest is that Scholem took the view that the major movements in Jewish mysticism were movements that developed in responses to various historical crises in Jewish history. And therefore, they're all reactive rather than proactive. I would rather take the view that Jewish mysticism began very early and developed in a continuous way within its own internal dynamic, almost oblivious to outside influences. And this is the opposite of a crisis mentality. This is also the opposite of what perhaps the greatest Jewish historian of our century, the late Professor Sela Baron, called the lachrymose ideology of Jewish history. The lachrymose ideology of Jewish history, which Baron worked his whole career of 50 years or more to undermine, is very dominant and very powerful. And that is the view that Jewish history is a perpetual nightmare. And Jews are always reacting against this nightmare. In other words, the Jews throughout their history never did anything. That Jewish history is rather what is done to them. And Baron wrote his magnum opus, his great history of the Jews, the social and religious history of the Jews. He died in the middle of it. He was already in the 90s, in the 17th or 18th volume, trying to show that this, what he called lachrymose ideology of Jewish history, was wrong. In that Jews have a tradition, have a continuous tradition, and that this tradition has been created in a creative way, and not simply as a result of what was done to them. I don't know if you're familiar with the great Israeli writer Chaim Hazaz. Hazaz once wrote a story. In Hebrew it's called Hadrashah. In English it's called The Lecture. And in this story, Hazaz writes about kids on a kibbutz in Israel being called in to study Jewish history. And there's a guy on the kibbutz, and he says to the kids, don't go to study Jewish history. And the kids say, why? We have to know Jewish history. And the guy, his name in the story is Yudka, Yudka says to them, because there is no such thing as Jewish history. He says, history is what a people creates. History is what a people does. Not a history of what is done to them. Therefore, he says, Jews don't have any history, so it's better if you go and play soccer than if you study Jewish history. Baron proved that this view is incorrect. Namely, that Jews created a religion, an economy, a politic, a sociology, and a history. And that's why he called his book The Social and Religious History of the Jews. And that this developed not simply as a reaction to what was done, but this developed creatively out of the internal dynamics of the creative development of the Jewish people. And so the position or the approach that I'm taking here is very different than the kind of approach that Scholem took. Scholem's approach was to try to show that all of Jewish mysticism arose as a reaction to a certain crisis situation, crisis point in Jewish history. What I am going to try to show is that Jewish mysticism began very early in Jewish history and thought, and that certain seeds and trends that you find very early simply develop according to their own internal dynamic within Judaism, and that this development is not, as Scholem tried to show, even a linear development. In other words, that it's not you go A, B, C, D, E, this century, this century, this century, this century, but rather it's a kind of flow. In certain centuries, certain ideas develop, and then they fade out, and then they come back 500 years later. That it's a very rich tapestry, and not simply a linear history. There is another problem that is very common in the study of Jewish mysticism within Jewish studies, and that is the imposition of Western categories on the study of Judaism and on the study of Jewish mysticism. I don't want to go into this in any great detail except to say that in our culture, when we approach a subject as how it's different than another subject. In other words, we're always making categories. We're always fitting things into little definitional boxes. And the idea of academic disciplines is one of the ways in which we fit things into little boxes. So we have a box called, say, law. We have a box called ethics. We have a box called philosophy. And we have another box called mysticism. What I'm going to suggest to you is that if you study the history of Judaism, what you find is that when you try to apply these categories to the actual study of Jewish texts, to the actual study of Jewish thought, Jewish personalities, Jewish movements, what you find is that they are so inextricably intertwined that you can't make these very neat and crisp distinctions. This is important, for instance, when dealing with Jewish mysticism, because very often people make a distinction between Jewish mysticism, meaning mysticism, something that's different or even antithetical to philosophy. But I can show you many examples in the history of Jewish mysticism where you have a really philosophical Kabbalah, where you have a Kabbalah that is a rational structure, a rational system, not unlike many philosophical systems. Or where you have a mystical ethics. I mean, consider, for example, if you were a librarian and certain books fell in your hand and you had to categorize them. Is this a book in ethics or is this a book in mysticism? Certain of the great manuals of mystical ethics, particularly those written in the 17th and 16th century, you can't say this is mysticism and not ethics, or ethics and not mysticism. They're both. Or books of law. The last authoritative code of Jewish law, as some of you know, is the Shulchan Aruch, written by Joseph Caro in the 16th century. Caro was a great Jewish mystic. And the question is, are you going to say, Monday morning from 10 to 11 he was a Kabbalist and 11 to 12 he was a mystic? You can't do it. Caro wrote many of his works, including his legal works, precisely because he was a mystic. Because he believed that he had, Scholem translates the Hebrew term magid as spiritual intelligence, because he had this spiritual being that used to talk to him, telling him to write legal works. So is he a Kabbalist or is he a legalist? So it's not very clear that we can make these kinds of distinctions. And therefore, when talking about Jewish mysticism, we're also talking about all these other things. Another example, which comes really beginning in the Renaissance period, in what is called the Christian Kabbalah. In other words, the Jewish mystical tradition as it was taken and understood, particularly beginning in the Renaissance, by Christians, and developed from there. In the Christian Kabbalah, they made a distinction that later entered into a lot of Jewish literature and a lot of popular literature, and that is to make a distinction between two forms of Jewish mysticism. In other words, to divide Jewish mysticism into two different manifestations. And if you've read about the field, you've probably heard these terms. In Hebrew, this is what is called in Hebrew the Kabbalah iyunit, means the speculative mysticism or mystical theology, and the Kabbalah ma'asit, the practical mysticism, namely the practice of mysticism, which includes such things as the mystical experience, but more precisely focuses on the practice of various kinds of magic. This distinction between the Kabbalah iyunit, the ideas of the mystics, and the Kabbalah ma'asit, the practice of the mystics, I would say is really a bogus distinction. Because you really cannot, as I mentioned before, separate the conceptual from the experiential, and because the concepts themselves offer a framework in which you can understand the experiences. And let me make one more distinction, and then we'll take a little break. And that is another distinction that we often read about, and which I think is also another example of a false distinction. And that is a distinction between Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and everything else in Judaism. I would approach it, and I am approaching it, a totally different way. There is a book written by, I think he was a Mormon, called Jones, his name was, called Christian Mysticism. And in the appendix to this book, he gives himself a homework exercise. And the homework exercise is to try to find a good definition of mysticism. And he, as the result of his research, lists over 100 definitions of mysticism he found, and comes up with the conclusion that none of them are good. Now, after him, or perhaps while he was still alive, there was a woman writing about mysticism, not Jewish mysticism, but mysticism in general, in England, who I would say is the greatest writer in the English language on mysticism. And this is a woman whose name was Evelyn Underhill. She lived around the time of World War I in England. And even though her books are not advertised, they're still in print. 80, 90 years later. They're still in print now. And one of the things that Evelyn Underhill said in her books was that mysticism is simply the most intense form of religion. In other words, that you can't make a distinction between religion and mysticism, or in our case, Judaism and mysticism, but rather that mysticism is religion in its most intense form. So I would say that if we want to understand what is Jewish mysticism, we have to understand the following things. The first thing is that one of the reasons Jones was unable to define mysticism is because he wasn't approaching mysticism as a mystic. I doubt that a mystic would want to or would try to define mysticism. Why? Because the very word define comes from define, which means of limits. The mystic doesn't want to put limits, doesn't want to put crisp categories. So I would say one of my litmus tests for the mystic is that a mystic is a person who doesn't want to define mysticism. That's not saying that all people who don't want to define mysticism are mystics. But a mystic, I don't think, would even ask that question. Define it. So in dealing with Jewish mysticism, we're not dealing, and you notice to this point, and I'm not going to later either, give you a definition of Jewish mysticism or of mysticism. Because as I said, I want to approach Jewish mysticism the way the Jewish mystics did. And as far as I know, they don't give you definitions. The mystic doesn't need one, and the non-mystic will think the definition equals the thing defined and therefore be wrong already. So what's the point? And if mysticism is a journey, the journey is never ending. So why define it? Why limit it? Secondly, if mysticism is the quintessence of religion, if it's, as Underhill put it, religion in its most intense form, then you can't dislodge mysticism from religion. You can't, in our topic, dislodge mysticism from Judaism, or Judaism from mysticism. In other words, that Jewish mysticism is an inextricable part of Judaism. And let me give you one simple example. I'm not ready to try to convince you now, but I hope by the time all of our discussions are over, you will be convinced. If you want to see what the guts of a religion are, the place to look is in its liturgy, in its prayers, in its rituals. In the 19th century, the father of modern Orthodox Judaism, the late Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, was asked by a Catholic, where can I find the catechism of the Jews? Because you know, in Catholic religious education, the first thing they teach them is the catechism, catechismics. And Hirsch pulled out a prayer book and said, the prayer book is our catechism. In other words, if you want to see what Judaism is all about, look in the prayer book. Now, if you look in the traditional Jewish prayer book, I would suggest that you find, and in commonly practiced Jewish rituals, that you find the overwhelming influence of the Jewish mystics. And I'll give you just a number of simple examples. Take, for instance, the celebrations of various Jewish holidays. Take, for instance, the Sabbath. You begin the Sabbath with the service welcoming the Sabbath, right? Called the Kabbalah Shabbat, welcoming the Sabbath. Where did this service come from? With these psalms and this hymn, the Lecha Dodi, Come My Beloved, and all this, totally from the mystics. You go to celebrate the Passover. You don't have a Seder plate. So you go to the store and you buy one of those prefabricated, metal Seder plates. And you notice that you're supposed to put certain things on the plate, but not only certain things on the plate, but certain things in a certain place on the plate. And in the fabricated plate is supposed to be certain things at a certain place. There are many different traditions. Where to put what on the plate? Because the things you should put on the plate that symbolize the various things of the Passover Seder are already discussed in the Talmud, but it doesn't tell you in the Talmud where to put them on the plate. Where do you find that out? It's from the mystics. And indeed, the things on the plate are put in a certain place to correspond, and we'll discuss this later on, to what is called in Jewish mysticism the Sfirot, or the divine powers, the various parts of the divine personality. Or, for example, you have after Passover, what's the next big Jewish holiday? Shavuot. Shavuot begins with staying up all night studying. This is called the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. The Tikkun of the night of Shavuot. This is an idea of the Lurianic Kabbalah, that the human function in the world is to make what they call tikkunim, acts that repair the world. So in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, early 20th century, say when one chassid met another chassid in the street, he didn't ask them how they were. How they were is not important. What's important is the world moving closer to redemption. So they'd say, not hello, how are you, but have you made a tikkun today? Have you repaired the world in some way today? I'm not talking about this magazine. That's politics. That has nothing to do with Kabbalah. Don't kid yourself. Today, every social action movement in the Jewish community is tikkun, has nothing to do with Jewish mysticism. Believe me. So you have tikkun Leil Shavuot. Or, for example, you go for the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Most of those liturgical hymns, called the Piyutim, these were written by Jewish mystics. The custom when you're saying the confessional of pounding your heart, pounding your breast, this is from the mystics. The Yartzeit, Yusker, mystics. What the mystics tried to do was to take the earlier traditions and to revitalize them with new meanings. So, for example, Sabbath. Sabbath in the Talmud is a day of rest. Sabbath for the mystics is a day of cosmic harmony. Harmony with the self, harmony with nature, harmony with the family, harmony with the universe. And they introduced various customs, or they reinterpreted old customs in the liturgy and introduced new prayers and reinterpreted old prayers in the liturgy to help imbue them with a new sense of meaning. So I would suggest if you look in the liturgy, which as Hirsch said is our catechism, you find the inordinate influence of the mystics. Jewish law. The last great code, as I mentioned to you, was written by Caro, who, for reasons I don't have time to explain now, but if you want, take my word for it, if he weren't a mystic, he wouldn't have written it. He wrote it particularly because he was a mystic. So, to summarize some of the points I've made. First, the approach that I'm taking here to Jewish mysticism is an attempt to understand Jewish mysticism as the Jewish mystics understood it. Secondly, to understand Jewish mysticism as an integral part of Judaism, not as a lunatic fringe, not as something inimical to Judaism, but as an integral part of Judaism, which is perhaps at the core, or perhaps is the core, of Jewish religious life, and certainly not as a feature or as a segment of Jewish religious life and history. Thirdly, to understand Jewish tradition, and in our case, Jewish mystical tradition, as a matter of continuity and development internally, rather than simply as a continuous example of crisis response, and to show how this tradition developed according to its own inner dynamic with minimal influence from outside. Let me just give you one example of this. Scholem's whole argument as to why the Lurianic Kabbalah developed in the 16th century was that it was a reaction from the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. A scholar at Hebrew University in Jerusalem spent 3 years reading all known Lurianic texts, trying to find a direct or even an indirect reference in the Lurianic literature to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and couldn't find it. Fourth, the approach I'm going to use will show that Jewish mysticism is rooted in early Jewish tradition, both biblical tradition and rabbinic or Talmudic tradition, rather than being something that came comparatively late or medieval, as Scholem tries to emphasize. Fifthly, the approach I'm going to try to use will try to show the integration of the conceptual with the experiential. In other words, the idea that the concepts of the Jewish mystics inform the experiences of the Jewish mystics, and then was enriched and amplified by it. And here you have a kind of irony, that in Hebrew the word Kabbalah comes from the root that kibel, which means to receive, but that there are two kinds of receiving that go on here. One is a passive receiving, but that there is also such a thing as an active receiving. And that the Kabbalists were not simply passive receivers, but also active receivers. I think that's enough for now, and I hope that after our little break you'll have some questions you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make.